We start our program today with a very special keynote presentation. I have the great pleasure to introduce you Luca Baraldi. In addition to being a very close person for us, he's a reference in the field of cultural dialogue. Luca is a musician and historian of religions. He has been working in the field of cultural diplomacy and cultural policies for more than 15 years and developed dozens of projects on cultural heritage, tourism, and community-based cultural development. For us, as APJ, a network working for the development of Jewish heritage projects in Europe, we have always found Luca's understanding of accessibility and inclusiveness very, very interesting. Listening to him is always a source of inspiration, and we thought that having the opportunity to have him on board with us in this framework of the meeting will help us to understand the importance of the project we are carrying out together. We encourage you to write your questions in the chat, since at the end of the presentation, we will have some time for Q&A. So Luca, dear friend, thank you very much for participating in this meeting. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Victor, and thank you the organization for the invitation. I must confess that after such an important presentation, it will be very difficult to try to say something interesting, but we'll try to do so. I just would like to add a few more details about my past professional courses, because I have been working for many years in the field of religious tourism as a driver for cultural dialogue and cultural economics. And yes, and I've had the pleasure of chairing as the director a campus of pontifical faculty in northern Italy next to Venezia, which has been strongly involved in fostering a new conception of religious tourism, not only as something connected with doctrine, but rather more connected with the cultural traditions and systems of culture, which have been characterizing European history across the centuries. But now I'm trying to share the screen. I think that somebody should...
now you should be able to do that.
Okay, I'll try again. Great. Desktop one. Okay, can you see the presentation?
Yes.
Okay, great. So first of all, I think it is important to define the concept that I tried to express in the title of the speech, which is some way describe the vision I would like to share with you today. Today, more than ever, it is essential to start talking about historical awareness again, outside the convenience of rhetoric. I don't mean simply that we have to know history to avoid repeating the mistakes of the past, but I mean something stronger. We need to know history to put ourselves in a position to evolve. The historian Eric Hobsbawm, in his The Short 20th Century, says that the new generations in the second half of 20th century run the risk of living, he says, in a permanent present. Accustomed to speed, superficiality, performance at any cost, we have lost the ability to look in depth, to search in depth. Knowing history is something uncomfortable. It is a process that requires time, work, the will to question oneself, the willingness to question one's own certainties. And when I talk about historical awareness, I'm not thinking about the description of what has been, but rather about how the knowledge of what has been can help us open our eyes to better understand what we can become. Not a story to avoid repeating mistakes, but rather to understand how to become constructive actors. When I talk about the future of Europe, the question that arises spontaneously is which Europe am I talking about? When it comes to institutional history or the history of society within the same institutional framework, we must be very careful not to be fooled. We must remember what the dimension of democratic dialogue means, of citizen participation in the construction and in the process of co-creation of an institutional architecture. The European project is certainly a geopolitical and economic, a diplomatic project. However, we must remember that it is above all a cultural and a social process. After the rupture of the wars of the 20th century, in which two world wars took the European territories as their scenario, after the trauma of the Holocaust and the programmatic destruction of a nation, of cultural systems, of entire ethnic groups, after the wounds of the Balkans, which mark an almost invisible history in European memory, so far away and so close, after all this, today, the European project can only be a project based on the acceptance of a common responsibility. Therefore, when I speak of the future of Europe, I speak of the future of a community united by common roots, which is expressed in a complicated but extraordinary pluralism. When I talk about Jewish culture, I am referring to every single manifestation that characterizes the history of the vitality of a nation, of a cultural vein that has sprinkled and animated the history of thought throughout Europe and the entire world. Being Italian, born and grown up between Modena and Ferrara, in one of the territories where Judaism has made one of its most important intellectual contributions, I have always perceived, almost physically, the Jewish presence as a necessary cultural presence. This need exists in every corner of Europe, even if there is no widespread awareness. I would like to add two very brief methodological premises. The first one is that history is not something about the past, but something we are immersed in on a daily basis. Each one of us at the same time is history, is part of history, and can make history. The second one is that present time is characterized by epistemological revolutions that call us to face knowledge with a new point of view, with a different perspective. Globalization and international mobility have opened conceptual horizons that were almost unattainable until a few years ago. At the same time, the web, the digital world, has radically changed our way of connecting with reality and of interpreting the reality with which we have to deal with every day. We are called to question ourselves today about what it means to be history and to make history in the time of virtualization, information obesity, information manipulation, of knowledge acceleration. We are called to ask ourselves what it means today to remain present, to remain real. Yuval Harari rightly said that we should consider ourselves as hackable beings, that we can be manipulated even if we don't want to accept it. For those who, like us, work on history, on the conservation of history, we must become aware of the new epistemological weaknesses. Making history also means being able to prevent history itself from being hacked. What will I try to say in my speech? What will be the steps of my reasoning? To simplify, I will try to guide you, to drive you in a reflection that starts from the theme of cultural heritage, in particular with a focus on religious heritage. And then I will move on to talk about Jewish history in connection with the physical heritage. And from there, I would like to open a perspective on Jewish history in Europe as the history of the Jewish nation, adopting the analysis criteria of the nation branding theory proposed by the diplomat Simon Hanold, to try to understand how the theme of Jewish heritage could be considered as a theme of what we could define social diplomacy. From this diplomatic vision, I would then like to introduce the Faro Convention and the social and broad impact implications for those dealing with Jewish heritage. And I will try to link this issue of collective responsibility to a broader, perhaps higher vision of culture and cultural heritage. And finally, I would like to launch a proposal, or perhaps a kind of provocation, for a concrete action, which can be activated in connection with the different territorial contexts. But stop wasting time. Let's embark on this lightning fast journey. When we talk about religious cultural heritage, we must be aware of the fact that we have to face a complex heritage, perhaps more complex than the usual. We must in fact take into consideration three different levels of conservation: the material conservation, symbolic and epistemic conservation, the functional conservation. In the case of Jewish heritage, the situation is complicated by the history of Jewish society within the European and international scenario. Normally, the cultural heritage is linked to a specific territory and to a chronological continuity. In the case of Judaism, we are dealing with the need to tell more stories, fragmented stories, linked to very distant cultural roots, dynamic cultural roots and ecosystems. The itinerant, I would say, character of Jewish history has given cultural heritage a different nature, in some way anticipating any reflection today on the necessary relationship between community and heritage. There is a problem of material conservation because the Jewish heritage has been dispersed, requisitioned, or destroyed several times over the course of history. There is a problem of connection between landscape, heritage, and community because we have many examples of material evidence of Jewish heritage and Jewish presence in territories and contexts where Jewish communities have not been present for decades or for centuries. And there is a problem of linguistic and conceptual accessibility because the Hebrew language represents an impermeable word and because symbolically Jewish culture is not a common background. Talking about Jewish heritage means addressing the issue of the close coessence between material and intangible, between the vitality of community and the uncertainty of the artifact. Above all, it means overcoming the conception, which is a limiting, probably distorting conception of the separation between cultural heritage and cultural history. I will try to explain myself with an example. It may sound strange, but let's think about it. For example, when we talk about the Italian Renaissance, we all think of a work by Caravaggio as a piece of cultural heritage. Caravaggio's painting is cultural heritage. At the same time, we are unable, or it is very difficult to recognize the Caravaggio's artistic thought as a part of cultural heritage, even if in fact his work is simply the range of his thought. Even the concept of intangible heritage is in fact tied to a phenomenon, to a perceptible, visible, or audible manifestation. In some way, we must recognize that our conceptual category of cultural heritage has been shaped by the need to make the management of a fluid process manageable within legal categories. Our conception of cultural heritage has been shaped by the need to manage something. To use a conceptual category created by Jewish thought by Zygmunt Bauman, there is nothing more liquid than cultural heritage in its historical flow. If we leave these schemes, in a certain sense, we can go so far as to say that European Judaism expresses its heritage as an ecosystem capable of producing thought. The way in which, for example, Messianism influenced the Renaissance thought, the way in which poetry has modeled the sacred language with the piyutim, the way in which the Kabbalistic conception developed by Cordovero or by Yitzhak Luria influenced profoundly the sense of individual responsibility for the healing of reality. From a certain point of view, the cultural heritage of Judaism is not the material one, but more in general, its intellectual legacy. In this we discover, and we have to be aware of one thing: Europe would not have existed without Jewish cultural vitality. The Europe we know today would be very different, certainly much poorer. I add a final element. The religious heritage is normally attributable to a substantially linear model. The artistic tradition evolves because certain aesthetic categories and certain technical skills evolve, but everything must be part of a physiological process, because above all, there is a stability of a solid and indisputable doctrine. In the Jewish case, the absence of dogmatism has allowed culture to develop, giving shape to the permanent, I would call it restlessness of research, debate, and experimentation. Somehow, as paradoxical as it may seem, the absence of, for example, a figurative dimension, a figurative tradition, has fueled a freer, a braver, a more experimental creativity. The heritage that we should promote on the European Days of Jewish Culture is not the synagogue, but the history of thought that takes shape in that specific synagogue. It's a human history, not only a cultural static history. We must not only share the intangible value of cultural heritage, which risks intellectualizing, dehumanizing cultural history. We must share the emotional value of historical memory, of cultural memory. Today, I would like to offer you an experiment. I would call it a food for thought that comes from an area that is distant from the technical conception of cultural heritage management. For those involved in tourism and cultural policies, the theme of nation branding is often connected to issues related to destination marketing. But I would like to address this theme from a diplomatic point of view. Nation branding, according to the meeting that I will try to share with you, is the result of a multi-level strategy that unites different sectors that make up the perception of a nation in the rest of the world, of a community, of a territory, of a city in the rest of the world. Today, I would like to try to analyze with you very quickly the hexagon of nation branding theory that the English scholar Simon Hanold proposed a few years ago. And I would like to try to apply it to the Jewish nation without chronological definitions, to try to contaminate the traditional conception of historiography of cultural heritage with one purpose: to foster a wider interpretation of cultural legacy as a pillar in the legitimacy building of a religious-based nation and social group. This is exactly the hexagon coming from the nation branding theory of Simon Hanold. As you can see, it could be applied to contemporary world. There are some concepts that seem to be to fit only our conceptual and social categories. But let's try to connect with outside of the chronological box. As regards the governance, if we imagine applying this conception to the legitimacy recognized in the history across the centuries to the religious and scientific leaders of the Jewish world, our doctors, rabbis, scientists, translators, and bankers perceived, how important were they and how important were they considered? As regards the exports, which is the public's image of products and services from each country, I would say in this case from each nation. I had the opportunity now more than 10 years ago to work on a research on the processes of the Inquisition on the state archives in Modena. Most of the trials involving Jews concern the authorities' difficulty and concern in preventing Christians from buying medicines, artifacts, jewelry, sweets, even clothes from Jewish workers. In the course of European history, Jewish production has always influenced the quality standards, has always enjoyed great prestige, even when it could not be said. As regard tourism, I don't want to mix the European Jewish nation and the Holy Land, but certainly the European cultural history and the European cultural imagination, the two things have always been linked, especially in some specific cases. As regards investment and immigration, this category is difficult to apply to a pre-contemporary world, but the topic of business authority should be analyzed more in depth. I think that it is important to reframe somehow also the central role of businessmen, I would call them like this, coming from Jewish communities in the wider social ecosystem in Europe. As regards culture and heritage, I don't want to add anything else to this issue, but Jewish heritage certainly represents and continues to represent one of the richest, though still unknown, treasures of the European cultural history. I myself have been working for years on authors who are almost unknown, who have actually deeply, strongly influenced many levels of European culture. I repeat myself, without the vitality of Jewish culture across Europe, Europe today would be completely different. As regards people and the conception and the Hanold conception of people as a parameter. On this issue, as is evident, the social conception cannot fail to be adapted to the historical era. It is difficult to talk about how tolerant the Jews were compared to a context in which there was often no tolerance towards Jews. But I want to highlight one thing, which I think is important. A few years ago, a French scholar, Esther Bombassat, wrote the book La souffrance comme identité. I think it has been translated as suffering as identity or something like this, which I believe expresses a great need as well as a great historical truth. It is essential to work together to create a history of Judaism, not only as a passive history. But let's go back to the Arnold diamond. I apologize for this conceptual forcing, but the purpose of this provocation was precisely to try to think about the history of cultural heritage in Jewish ecosystem from a different point of view. When we talk about Jewish culture in Europe, we are talking about what today we could define as nation branding. We're talking about the history of the recognition, both explicit or implicit, of the value of a multi-layered system that enjoyed great prestige despite everything. I don't want to trivialize the rawness or the cruelty of history, and I apologize if I somehow trivialize this perspective, but I want to propose this challenge in this specific context today. It is essential to rediscover and enhance, not only in academic circle, the constructive and transformative role that Judaism has played throughout Europe. It is time today to reaffirm that Judaism is not just a story of victims, but a story of creators. They have been an essential part of the social European ecosystem since ever. In 2005, the Council of Europe tried to rediscover and to give a new value to this necessary connection between the history of communities, between social history and the more practical issues of cultural heritage management. And in that year, the Council launched the Faro Convention, in which it proposes a new vision of cultural heritage, reaffirming the fundamental concepts. There can now be cultural heritage regardless of the life of the community that generated it, that has preserved it, that has modified it across the centuries. There is no cultural values of Piazza San Pietro in Rome, of the Petrovaradin fortress in Novi Sad, or in Pont Neuf in Paris, without people who walk, who sit to look at the landscape, who take pictures, who insert that cultural heritage in the scenography of their existence. In this way, cultural heritage becomes part of the collective memory. The convention introduces the concept of heritage community, which is defined as people who value specific aspects of cultural heritage, which they wish, within the framework of public action, to sustain and transmit to future generations. The purpose of the convention is trying to democratize heritage governance according to a complicated concept of democratic responsibility, which is based on the right balance between rights and duties. From the point of view of the concept of community-based heritage, meaning European cultural heritage, European cultural history needs the Jewish vision, needs the Jewish perspective, needs the Jewish contribution to reveal its true richness. And it has been like this since the beginning of European history. I believe that today the Jewish ecosystem has, in a certain sense, the responsibility of sharing its own history, its own vision of European cultural history, to allow the whole society, the whole European society, to open new possibilities for reflection, new doubts, new questions. Democratizing heritage governance means making the value of heritage accessible to the community. It means interpreting and knowing how to provide the tools to interpret. It means communicating and making it understandable regardless of the cultural of origin. It means opening questions on what are the strategy for managing the theme of historical identity in its dynamic nature. And I think that if we believe that culture should be considered as a common good, if we believe that cultural heritage could be considered as a shared richness, we must accept the responsibility, each of us, in expressing ourselves, in participating, in proposing, in taking actions. a practical proposals trying to, let's say, trying to turn theory into practice. I would like to share with you some questions. How are national policies applying the Faro Convention and ensuring that heritage communities are not an exclusive space? Have Jewish cultural systems in the various countries ever developed policy papers to propose their active role in facilitating the creation of heritage participatory governance? Perhaps it is just a provocation and should not become anything more, but perhaps a European Day on Jewish culture should reshuffle the cards. Perhaps it should tell the Jewish view of cultural history and not just the history of Jewish culture. Perhaps it should let external storytellers tell its story, reopening the complexity of culture to a story that is not only chronological, but conceptual and therefore more dynamic. Perhaps we should use the theme of dialogue to tell a great truth. History is a creature with many faces. From a certain point of view, if culture is an instrument, is a driver for activating thought, and if thought can become an instrument for transformation, we have the possibility and therefore the responsibility of translating an attitude of sharing our cultural heritage, our cultural potentialities, into an enabling element for tikkun olam, to heal with small gestures of transformation the cultural universe in which we live. Starting from the rediscovery of common memory means going out of the schemes of the narrative of multiculturalism to rediscover the real value of the uniqueness of every single culture. Starting from the value of the uniqueness of cultures and of every person in every single culture, we will have the opportunity to understand how we can translate our vocation, our vision into an action capable of leaving its mark. Maybe it's not just the time for storytellers, no more. Maybe the time has come for the story makers. Thank you.